We're living through intense times. We have an accelerating pace of change, and people have grown accustomed, it seems, to this life of the instant internet information world that we have, the constant phone usage, and remarkable but also clearly dangerous technology that's coming at us and coming at our jobs. We know tech billionaires increasingly run the stock market and our economy. They partner with the Trump White House, and many of them dictate everything from how AI will remake the job market to deploying lethal missions at the Pentagon. We mention this tonight because there's more and more information about what's going on in what are largely secretive, still often privately held AI companies. They might be more important than a lot of the companies on the stock market, but they're not transparent and governed that way. Take this new investigative report about one of the biggest AI companies backed by Microsoft. You've probably heard about ChatGPT. It's from OpenAI, and journalist Ronan Farrow, who's at The New Yorker and at one point used to work here, draws on more than 100 interviews, including several with Altman and private notes and other internal messaging systems, to look at how this increasingly powerful person operates. A board member telling The New Yorker that there's a strong desire to please people by Altman, but an almost, quote, sociopathic lack of concern for the consequences of deception. They say he's basically unconstrained by truth. There are internal memos that allege he was deceiving executives about safety protocols, which is a big deal when you think about how sweeping these companies are and their impact on the rest of us. Now, Altman's company is pushing back a bit. They told one outlet that the piece is basically rehashing previously reported material sourced from people with agendas. And that's just some of the investigative pressure on what at least some evidence suggests is a liar running a very important company. Meanwhile, Altman's also in the news because police arrested a suspect reportedly throwing a Molotov cocktail at a gate near his home. So you can see there's a lot of different pressures and different scrutiny on the people in charge. I mentioned that the markets are largely cut out of this because AI might be one of the fastest changes to how we get information, which affects, of course, news, media, democracy, but also how we all work and live. You might look up in a couple of years and find these companies haven't even gone public, but they've wiped out millions of jobs. And the question becomes, do we get a say about this in this democracy before it is too late, before all those jobs are gone, or these billionaires are even more powerful with a stranglehold over our information and our phones and what our kids watch? And I'm not trying to be alarmist. I'm just saying this is all happening now. It might be too late by the time everyone wakes up, which is a point that some Democrats are now making.
We need to develop a sense of urgency here.
If we are not careful, this is the type of technology that will overpower us, and the people will never forgive us for that.
All of this harm has occurred not in spite of, but because of the absence of federal legislation to regulate AI.
There is literally an existential threat to the existence of the human race.
We need to make sure the AI revolution works for all of us, not just the tech billionaires.
Sounds fair. Some of that sounds pretty sensible. And there is plenty of big talk. The AI companies almost seem to like stoking the idea that what they have is existentially threatening because it makes it sound more important and makes them more money if people think it's really that big a deal. And some politicians, from Trump to Sanders, exaggerate or oversell. We're familiar with that. And they talk about the existential threat as a reason to get more support for their agenda, including regulating these companies. Now, here's the way I'm going to put it, because I'm going to try not to have an agenda like either of those forces, the billionaires and the politicians. I'm just going to tell you, as someone who follows the news and law, that if there is a chance of an existential threat, let's call it a 10% chance, then yes, our society and your government has a very good reason to try to regulate against that. If this is a existential nuclear level threat, and now let's say one rung down. Let's say it's not an existential threat to everything. Let's just say that it risks 10 or 20 million jobs in America. Again, if there's a non-zero chance of that, don't you want your government looking into this? Sanders and AOC have introduced a bill to at least try to regulate the proliferation of these data centers for AI so there's better regulation. And that's going fast, and there's billions literally pouring into that. Meanwhile, There are other levers. It's not just Congress, especially when you look at how few things Congress gets done. We do have civil courts in this country, and we reported on this program about how Facebook's parent company and Google had to pay millions when they lost this a case over how their products are hawked to young people and how addicting they make them. Axios has found that Meta, the Facebook company, is deliberately removing ads for attorneys who seek clients harmed by social media on Meta. The technical term for that is, it's pretty messed up. But all is not lost. Journalists, like those I mentioned, are reporting on this, and we have to do some heavy thinking about this much concentrated power. There's a longtime writer in this space, Elizabeth Spires, who also points out the anti-intellectualism of some of these tech billionaire elites, that they target knowledge from elites below. That would include writers and the media and the free press. A bedrock conviction among the oligarchs, she argues, that they've mastered everything and have nothing left to learn. Or take the Atlantic writer Thomas Chatterton, who says there's a problem with what he calls powerful men who think any introspection is dumb. America's tech oligarchs are, he argues, pathologically unreflective. They see it as a waste of time to look inward and consider what makes a life worth living: humanity, equality, diversity, the things that many people think are important in a society. He notes the people who seem least interested in introspection are those whose work is most profoundly shaping our reality.
We need to develop a sense of urgency here.
If we are not careful, this is the type of technology that will overpower us, and the people will never forgive us for that.
All of this harm has occurred not in spite of, but because of the absence of federal legislation to regulate AI.
There is literally an existential threat to the existence of the human race.
We need to make sure the AI revolution works for all of us, not just the tech billionaires.
Confronting big tech and AI before it's too late, that's what some liberals there you saw are calling for. And we have a special conversation on this tonight. I've invited two people who've thought about a lot of these issues. Thomas Chatterton Williams is an Atlantic staff writer, quoted his piece. And Jelani Cobb is Dean of the Columbia School of Journalism, a staff writer for The New Yorker. Welcome to both of you. One of the problems with talking about tech is sometimes you only end up with the techies. And while they know the tech part, which is cool, and I've had some of them on here, I wonder if the human part is as or more important to humans. And so I'm curious what you think of this massive power and how tech billionaires, or AOC calls them oligarchs, increasingly have control of our economy, our labor markets, our sources of information and journalism.
There are a couple things here, right? One, when people start talking about existential threats, the first thing that you reasonably go to is nuclear arms. These are controlled by governments. These are not just kind of random corporate entities that all have control of nukes. But when we develop a technology that could have that scale of existential threat to human existence, we see, if people have seen the film Oppenheimer, we see that he is racked by guilt and torn up by the implications of what he's done, even as he's done it in the midst of a war that posed its own series of threats and so on. The part that we don't talk about, we think something we thought about during the Cold War, we don't think about very much since then, is that Oppenheimer's Soviet counterpart, Andrei Sakharov, had a similar experience, engineered the Soviet atomic bomb, and then said this is the weapon that we should never use, and spent the rest of his life fighting for human rights and arguing against nuclear proliferation. And so that is the kind of character, the kind of person that you want to at least have some sort of moral concern about what the implications of this kind of weaponry or technology can be on the other side, which is why I thought Ronan, of course, is like, my colleague at The New Yorker, so maybe I'm not an unbiased source, but I thought Ronan's piece on Sam Altman was really interesting in exactly that regard, because they're asking, does this person even have that sensibility? Does this person have that kind of consciousness about the powers of the technology that he's in charge of?
Well, it gets at one of the main problems with this era. When you contrast it with the type of stewards of nuclear weapons and nuclear technology, you have a class of people that have amassed more power and wealth in individual hands than have ever been in such small possession. And they don't just ignore this kind of stewardship, but they openly disdain the kind of introspection and self-awareness and reflectiveness that allows you to have a kind of theory of mind for others and extend empathy. And I think we should all be highly alarmed by the kind of the kind of adolescent Nietzscheanism that is on display here, where it's just act and then forget. A strong man does. A weak man sits around and stews and thinks and worries and apologizes. I think these people behave in ways that most of humanity is not aligned with, yet they're the architects of the collective reality that's supposed to become aligned with humanity. It's a strange paradox.
It really is. And I feel as someone who's living in the news every day, and we're obviously covering all these big things, and yet this is one of the big things that's just outside of you, but it's really big. And you inspire, as I quoted in this setup, because you're both looking at what you mentioned, which is what's the framework for these people. Right. She goes on to write that many of these Silicon Valley elites believe deep intellectual work has no value. They disdain for it, and it's fueled their attacks on higher ed, humanities, learning for its own sake, which they believe has no purpose beyond digitization and monetization.
One of the things that really struck me in this week that we've been talking about the New Yorker profile of Sam Altman is a 2018 piece in the New York Post where it was reported that he had joined a wait list to digitize his brain. The catch is that the process kills you. So he's willing to part with his biological life to make himself a PDF file or to become a living chat bot. It's terrifying, but this is the person that's actually the architect of the reality we're all going to be stuck in. And they're making decisions where there's no democratic process where we get to weigh in and say that, I mean, most of us, I would venture to say, would not be comfortable having physician-assisted suicide to become a machine.